In this episode, I speak to Joe French, who lost 5 of his colleagues to a huge serac collapse on Mount Everest in 2014, in a disaster which killed 16 Sherpa. He was traumatised by trying to document the aftermath of that disaster as a cameraman, but when he returned to Everest the following season on another documentary, he was caught in the earthquake and avalanche that destroyed most of Everest Base Camp, which killed 22 people on either side of him and 9,000 people across Nepal. He survived that disaster and the trauma of it as well, but at the time he was also coping with his wife Julie's cancer diagnosis and other mental health issues of his own. And so I shot this discussion to share with you how he used a very simple activity in nature, both to cope with and actually to heal from the post-traumatic stress that he was going through at the time. Lots of you who watch this channel are trying to accommodate to the stresses of trying to perform in sports like climbing and to deal with all the physical and mental challenges that come along with that, as well as all the mental health problems that we are vulnerable to. And for a long time, I've thought that that is really the missing piece in many athletes' training programs, as well as the wider picture of mental health therapy in general. And that's not a new idea. John Muir was saying that a century ago, but humans make the same mistakes over and over again. So hence I invite you to listen to how simple Joe's regime was, and yet how it does hang on a few important details. So enjoy this discussion with Joe French.
I moved up to Loch Harbour about 20 years ago now, and that was to work for an arts project up here called Room 13. I immediately felt like this was my second home. And it was actually while I was working at the high school, Ed Grinley came up to me and he said, "I think we should make a film about Ben Nevis."
Oh, right.
Yeah. And so it was actually him that, and he says, "Oh, I know Dave McLeod."
And that's how we ended up sharing a rope together on a route on Ben Nevis, which was Don't Die of Ignorance. So we did the first free ascent of Don't Die of Ignorance on Ben Nevis, which was an aid route first put up by Andy Cave and Simon Yates in the late 80s. The name comes from the old advert about AIDS, the disease, and there was a big public health scare at the time. And I presume it was like a nod to the aid climbing that they'd used on this route, which was a bit unusual at the time, but it was like an obvious target to free. And I tried that route a few times and then ended up trying it with you. And it was one of those funny things that, like, that day, I don't know, to me that was a great day out climbing. Classic Ben Nevis new routing in winter. I always remember being stood on the plateau in the dark with you and you saying, "Dave, that was the best route I've ever done, but I think I want to give up winter climbing." And to me, I was just like really confused by that, because I was sort of like, that was a brilliant day out, and it was one of the best winter climbs that I'd done as well. But I just wanted to get up the next day and do the same. You found Don't Die traumatic, so why was that climb traumatic for you? Like to put it in such strong terms.
At the time that I went along with you, I had quite a lot going on in my life, and I was actually just kind of thinking about leaving Fort William and selling the house and kind of maybe going back to Sheffield. Anything was possible. I didn't even really think about it. I thought, climbing with Dave, new route, it will be fine. You know, of course.
Yeah.
And let's go for it. So it wasn't until we were walking in and I actually saw Don't Die for the first time, I was like,
yeah.
What have I done?
Well, I mean, there's a reason there was no routes up the front of that face, That's hard.
Yeah.
And they were good climbers, Andy
Yes.
Cave and Simon Yates, and they aided it. So
Yes.
yeah, there's always going to be a reason for that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think when you said, "Oh, I've been trying this route, and I don't think I'll do it, but it'd be great if you come along and we'll see." And so I wasn't really thinking you were going to do it,
Aye.
and then you did it.
Yeah.
And I was like, "Oh no, that means I've got to do it."
My view was like, well, I'm not going to worry too much about it, but like, there's gear, you'll be able to aid across, and it'll be challenging. But it just didn't quite work out.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't, because it is a traverse.
Yeah.
Obviously, I thought that I could just kind of easily just aid, and we talked about it on the way in, and I'll just put my picks in the thing, and I'd work away like this. But actually, within the first move, I'd managed to get myself
iron crossed,
stuck like that, and because it was an overhang, there was nothing for my feet.
Yeah.
So pretty much within the first move, I was out of my depth.
Yeah.
And then I was stuck.
Yeah.
And obviously, because it's a traverse, you couldn't give me any help from the rope.
No. Yeah.
And so suddenly it was like, oh, Oh gosh.
From my position, I was trying to read what was going on by trying to read the body language of John, who was in the corrie, watching and filming, John Sutherland, and he kept on like looking away from the camera, and he was like looking concerned, and I could hear the odd shout. But I just remember we were trying to communicate through the wind, and it was hard in the gust, but then this one clear thing going, I need to untie one of the ropes, and being like, and at first I was like, why? And I was like, yeah, I can see why, because you're going to be in that baby bouncer situation. It's not an ideal situation, is it, on one 7.9mm rope?
Yeah.
Going over all those edges.
Yeah. Well, I think that why you asked me why I found that so traumatic, I think was as it kind of built up. So first of all, I was stuck like this, and then because I couldn't move, I had to rip one of your bits of protection out. So I did that, but then all my weight came onto one axe. Yeah. And then I was sliding down the axe, and there was only one thing I could do was let go. So I let go, and because I was climbing in leashes, the leash just kind of grabbed onto my wrist, and I was hanging all my weight from the leash. Yeah. And at that time, it was just really so frightening that I almost it almost stopped becoming frightening, and I started to witness that fear from a place
from the outside,
outside of it, and I managed to come up with a plan, and I got the Jumar off my harness, and I managed to do a one-arm pull-up, which I've never done before, and it gave me enough height to flick the axe free. Yeah. So by the time I was hanging there underneath, looking at this big clump of iced up knots and seeing that they were going in two directions, there was only one option, and that was to untie one of them. And the amount of adrenaline that was going through my system at the time, and trying to figure out which knot, and every time I went up, I could see it on a black lip.
And I was watching it from the belay as well, like, that was not very nice,
And so all of that combined, and then getting to you, and because I'd taken so long, I got to you, and your lips were blue and you're completely pale. Because you dropped down layers, hadn't you, to make yourself light?
I just had a base layer and a pack light Gore-Tex, and that was it. And I think in my sort of naivety, I hadn't set the belay up very well, so I was kind of holding you on the belay plate, and so when you initially fell, I kind of got pulled sideways, and I was like sort of on one foot, sort of sideways, holding the rope, like I hadn't done it on a guide plate. So I was just in that position for 6 odd hours. So I was definitely hypothermic, because I'd gone through all the shivering uncontrollably stages, and then got a full-on euphoria where I was just like floating, and it was all the cold was gone, all the pain was gone, and all sense of like the situation being any serious was all gone. So when you arrived, I was just sort of like, oh, here he is, hi, this is great. And I just remember you looking at my face and just having a total double take.
Yeah. Oh, goodness me. So we were both going through a traumatic experience at the same time.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, I wouldn't call it traumatic though, because like to me, like you arriving was the end of the trauma, because it's like, right, bang, right, let's finish the route now. Like, we can get out of this. The delay, which was the problem, really, was over. Until I asked you for the rack. Like, right, okay, give us a rack.
It was your face, so you said, right, where's the rack, Joe? And because I'd untied the rope, I've obviously couldn't get to the thing. So all our gear was still in the traverse. But in that moment, Dave, you were so calm and together. Like you say, you've just gone through hypothermia into a place beyond it.
Yeah. Well, perhaps I was calm because of the hypothermia, not despite
that
it.
chilled you out.
Yeah.
But I just remember that, but you just climbed down, got the gear, came back up, and we went for it, and I just loved you for your calmness in that situation. The experience was a huge experience on top of a lot of stuff that was going on. So afterwards, I experienced, quite a manic time of things, and it was quite hard to actually stop the adrenaline almost, and in my book I write about it almost like post-traumatic joy, in that I was just so relieved to have got through it, to have done the route with you, to have and it was quite an amazing time. And I just met Julie actually as well, who is my wife, and we fell, in love with each other, and all that was all happening at the same time. And so climbing this thing that has always been such a therapy in some ways can also cause these ripples in our psyche and so on, and can be quite obviously a dangerous thing as well, not just for our physical health but for our mental health as well. Where climbing for us is normal because we've always done it, but it's still quite an extreme activity, and I think it's easy to forget that sometimes. I wanted to write about it in the book as a traumatic experience because I think it's a good illustration of how we can kind of go up, and maybe sometimes when we go up we create a room for ourselves to go down into. And I remember after that, after a long period of elation, there was a kind of depression set in, and that really kind of made me think about my own mental health and how I was, and how climbing and nature can give us so much in terms of healing, but can also give us some traumatic experiences as well.
Yeah, I mean that's what's so striking in the book, because then you go on to discuss what happened to you next, which was you got more and more into climbing filmmaking, and that eventually took you to Mount Everest, making documentaries, and you were there with a young professional athlete who was going to jump off the top of Mount Everest, like the kind of ultimate like showbiz adventure sports thing, but then that ended in a total disaster. Can you just describe like what happened like that?
Well, yeah. So in the book I write about 3 trips to Everest. So after Don't Die and our experience, that was basically my way into adventure filmmaking, and from being an adventure cameraman I became a producer director, which is what I do now. And I went to Everest as in 2014 to film this first base jump wingsuit. I think it's a wingsuit flight from the summit, and he was going to jump out and release and land at base camp, and it was all going to be on live television. And that was the first big tragedy of that sequence was 2014, when 16 Sherpa were killed in the icefall, just as we were preparing for the shoot. And I was actually due to be filming with them for behind the scenes footage. I remember hearing them set off early that morning, and right at the last minute plans were changed, so I didn't have to go with them. I remember lying back in my tent thinking, thank goodness. And then a couple of hours later hearing this, a bomb going off. Basically the reverberations of it were echoing all around the amphitheatre of Everest, and 5 of our team were killed and 16 Sherpa in total. Because I was there to film, I had the camera, and I was actually filming the coordination of the rescue recovery attempt, and it was almost good because the camera was a barrier between me and the events that were unfolding. We knew we had to make a documentary about it, and we did, but it kind of got me thinking, I think in 2014, about the ethics of filmmaking within those circumstances. So when I went back in 2015, I was I'd been through quite a lot at that point. My wife Julie had cancer, and I thought going back in 2015 was a great chance to go and see the friends from 2014 and maybe find some closure with it. But then the earthquake happened, which was a huge earthquake in Nepal, and 9,000 people across the country were killed, and it triggered a big avalanche above base camp. And where we were in base camp, at Adventure Consultants camp, right in the middle, it basically landed right on our tent. And I was very lucky not to be there. I was actually out interviewing my friend Lak Parita about the previous year's tragedy, and I was walking back, and that's when the glacier started cracking and moving, and I started filming. I instantly picked my camera out and kind of looked round to see what was going on. Suddenly I saw this big wall of debris and avalanche coming straight towards me, and I thought, wow, that's an amazing shot. And then I realised that it was about to kill me.
Yeah.
And so I turned and ran, and it hit me. It took me off my feet, and because of the way it landed, it was like a bomb blast, and the blast.
So it was air that took you off your feet first.
The air, yeah. I've heard people say between or around 500 kilometers an hour was the shock blast.
Yeah, but then it's immediately followed by boulders of ice.
Everything.
Yeah.
There was boulders, snow, everything.
Yeah.
And so 22 people lost their lives. I was very lucky. All my airways got filled up. I was really struggling for breath. And again, during that time, I had a profound experience where I kind of became a witness to the events that were unfolding rather than the person they were kind of happening to.
Yeah.
But straight after that, I then, once I'd realised that I was still alive, I kind of staggered out through the snow and found that the people next to me or maybe 30 feet away from me hadn't been so lucky, and were dying really violently. And I had a camera, and I was being paid by Discovery Channel to be there, and suddenly, with all the stuff that was going on with me and what I'd just been through, then I was thrust into this quandary about what to do and how to navigate and what is appropriate to film and what's not appropriate to film, and should I be helping or what should I be doing, basically.
Yeah.
And so that level of stress on top of everything else was quite a lot to navigate and deal with.
Yeah. I mean, like the immediate aftermath of that avalanche just sounded like a scene of carnage. It is the only comparison really is a kind of war scene where there's like multiple people dead, and lots of people very badly injured and needing rescued, needing dug out, and you maybe needed to kind of intervene and help out with that in the kind of immediate minutes, but it was more like the rest of the day and the following day where you seemed to be absolutely torn whether to actually film or whether it was even the right thing to be there filming and showing that. But isn't that the same as the previous year where you have this like circus on Everest, and then it can all go so badly wrong. Doesn't that need to be shown, to be documented just the same? Like what's the difference?
There was an amazing rescue recovery kind of underway within minutes of the earthquake happening, and that itself was causing the conflict with me, that this story needs to be told, but do these people want a camera in their face now while they're covered in blood, while they're dealing with this? Do they want me, or should I just sit back and film them, and not get involved? But my gut instinct, was to help and to be, first of all, a human being, that it really was all hands to the deck, and to stand back at that point and just film, I couldn't do that. No, that makes sense. I mean, to me, the complex issue is the difference between telling a story
on film, which I think is important, and selling a story. At what point are you actually participating in this? Are you actually part of the circus and actually fueling it, where people are going to Everest to climb it as a kind of ego trip to, collect the trophy and to show everyone that they've collected it, and to make them feel like they're a good person for having done that. And sometimes social media and TV can stray into that terrain where it feels like you're actually part of that, and that makes me uncomfortable.
With our phones, we've got the opportunity to film everything, and I suppose this is just a question of, is it always appropriate to film someone when stuff's going wrong, when people are under pressure, and then the kind of consequences of that going forward, because you don't know how that person's going to be, if they can't give you informed consent that this is actually, I'm in a good frame of mind and you're fine to film me, please, go ahead. In that situation, no one could really give me informed consent, I don't think.
Yeah.
And the stuff that we were being presented with was certainly not stuff I was comfortable filming. I knew I had to cover it some way, so I turned the camera on myself and filmed some of myself and explained what was going on. But I just didn't want anyone to feel that they were being exploited in amongst this darkness. And that to me was the most important thing. And so when I came back here to Fort William, I found that I was thinking about it, having nightmares, questioning myself deeply about how I responded.
I do think this is like the relevance to like most people, because everyone is publishing their lives or a version of their lives on social media. You can feel sensitive to the idea that it's like, oh, it's self-promotion or it's all about ego, but it's not always. I'm personally glad when other people share their own difficulties or stories on the internet, and I think it is helpful, and yeah, people should think twice before not doing it.
It's a fine line between telling our stories to help people, telling our stories to promote ourselves, telling our stories because we are storytellers, and that's what we do as humans. And I think now there's so many ways we can tell these stories that it can almost be overwhelming.
I mean, when you say that, it makes me think of like just that difference between image and reality on social media. So
yes, that's good. That's good. Yeah.
So
yes. Yeah.
I think it's good to create ideals and like things that people can aspire to, but it's tricky because sometimes it drifts into being fake.
Yeah.
And then it's tricky as well.
Yeah.
So I find that I publish lots of media online all the time on daily basis, and I find that's like I'm trying to find the best way to live myself, and so I'm trying to share that with other people. So that's almost like imaginative. You're trying to think of the very best version of life that you aspire to yourself, but at the same time you're trying to be realistic about the difficulties, and it's a tricky balance to strike. Because it's an image of reality, it's not actually reality.
And for you, I guess, as a professional athlete as well, you have a responsibility to do that. For you need to be high profile.
Yeah.
Whereas,
although that aspect of it I find straightforward.
Yeah.
I mean, I could just post like pictures of sins and videos and stuff of training. If I want, I could do very low key social media that's not particularly, challenging to produce. I could just post pictures of me doing boulder problems. A lot of professional climbers do that. That's absolutely fine. Yes, I don't find that aspect of it hard. Actually, it's sometimes in the past it's actually bothered me when people dismiss it, and including with social media. Sometimes I get a little bit irritated when people say that's all bullshit. Just it's all about ego. And it's like, no, it's not. There's a portion of it that is, but yeah.
It's just we're all experiencing it from our own perceptions, and so it's how people choose to use it, I guess. And as people that produce media, producing it in a way that we feel that is aligned with our ethics.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One of the reasons I wanted to interview was not about what actually went on and all the traumatic events that you had, but it was actually what you did in response to them. So, when you came back from Everest, I think you did have a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress, but were you ever diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder?
No.
No.
I recognised the symptoms of what was going on with me. Particularly, there was one moment when I was on my mountain bike and I was going for a cycle, and I was just going down the hill, and suddenly there's a noise in my ears, and it was the wind, and it just took me straight back to the blast, the air shock blast of the avalanche, and the noise that was in my ears as I was suffocating. And so actually I began experiencing the avalanche again as a physical reality, just from the trigger of the wind in my ears. So I got off my bike and thought, perhaps I should go and speak to someone about this. So I went to see a doctor. He said it was likely I was experiencing some post-traumatic stress. And if it persisted, that would become post-traumatic stress disorder. So when it started interfering.
So did it persist?
I think that it is, it's a work in progress. I mean, he suggested that I called someone and gave me a photocopy of a fact sheet and so on, and maybe some sleeping pills or whatever to help me with the nightmares and so on.
Yeah.
And I was very grateful for the help, but it just didn't seem to kind of be what I needed.
Yeah.
And so I came to this place, the forest.
Yeah. But did you know in advance that that's what you needed to do, or were you just doing it anyway?
No, I've always been drawn to nature, and particularly with the solo climbing. And when I was younger, I was very into solo climbing on the edges of Gritstone, and I can just remember that. The complete encapsulation of the moment when you are climbing in the flow and all you're thinking about is the next move, and so on. It almost sounds like a cliche but it is it's what we experience, and it's a very much for me a moving meditation, and the more you can be in that state, the more you are distancing yourself from your thoughts. And so when I came to the forest, I started off, I was running in my trainers, and because it's so wet in here, I had about 3 different pairs, and they're all getting very stinky, and Julie was complaining about the smell. And so I took my shoes off and came and started running barefoot. And immediately, as soon as I started running barefoot, I started to feel this connection with the moss, with the forest, which was a lot deeper than when I was wearing trainers, bizarrely. While I was running, I started to recognise the similarities between solo climbing on the Gritstone and running barefoot, in that it required complete presence of mind on where your foot was landing to avoid a branch, to avoid hurting yourself. And so I discovered a similar state of flow to that I already experienced as a kid climbing here in the forest. And so this became an obsession and a really wonderful way of creating distance between me and the troubling thoughts I was having.
So it's like a detachment. Is that the right way to...
Yeah, I guess that when that moment of complete terror on Don't Die happened, when I was hanging by my wrist loop, and I became a witness to it. And again on Everest, when there was all this fearful cartwheeling mind going on as I was suffocating, but again a witness. I started to think about, well, if I could find the witness there, perhaps I can find it to these thoughts I'm having. And by doing an activity like barefoot running, and also cold water immersion, I got really into, or still am really into. I found that was a very quick physical way of getting into your body and out of mind. I had some really big experiences, and I had some really challenging reactions within my mind to that. But if I could witness them, they would lose their power a little bit more than if I was constantly caught in that loop of going around. And it's really not easy to do, but by the barefoot running and the cold water, I found that there was just this little gap.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I'd love to kind of get into that more of like the why barefoot in particular, like because I think it's pretty uncontroversial. You know, John Muir was saying it a long time ago that your time in the mountains, time in natural places, was very important for well-being in general. So that's been known for a long time. But it's interesting with barefoot running. I mean, you'll also be aware that it's had a big upsurge in recent years, and very popular. But it's still a slightly controversial idea, and you know, you'll find some people who have said it's amazing. You know, it's so different from normal running, and then other people who are a little bit more cautious, saying, well, yeah, I know it's like super popular and all that, but actually, like, it just hurt my feet and injured me. And I always like to dig into the details there, because I always think sometimes they can be really contextual. I mean, where we are now, it is like a bed of thick moss. And I was wondering, is that the difference? Are people trying to run on hard surfaces on bare feet? And is that important? Like, what's good about here in particular?
Wow, I mean, it's a really good point, because I think when you start saying, oh, I run barefoot, people assume that you run barefoot everywhere. Mm-hmm. And it's obviously not always appropriate to be running barefoot, you know, and so it's about finding locations that it works, I think, first and foremost. And forests like this with the moss, and also beaches, soft sand, fields with soft grass, they're the places you want to be trying it, not on hard surfaces and not on kind of rocky boulder fields.
Yeah.
And so it's definitely kind of location dependent. People still do think it's a kind of weird thing, and sometimes when I go past barefoot, I do get some really strange looks. Yeah. But for me, I just the grounding aspect of it. I think, and again, I think that's what I learned after Don't Die with you, was that I had this big upsurge, this post-traumatic joy, I called it afterwards, and I got carried away with it, and I forgot to keep myself grounded. I didn't know to keep myself grounded, actually. I got a very good bit of advice from a Buddhist friend of mine who said that it's okay to have your head in the clouds, but you've got to keep your feet on the ground at the same time. Yeah. And I think barefoot running is kind of pretty much the ultimate. Yeah.
And was that the same person that you mentioned? They said, have you ever tried gardening?
Yes.
Yes. Now, see, when I read that in your book, that made me sort of connect all these things, because so the idea, I was thinking about barefoot running, and I mean, I've had eczema on my feet most of my life, and so I always wore shoes and socks to protect my feet because they were bleeding, you know, and contact with the ground and dust and all that made it worse. So like I'm totally not used to moving anywhere without shoes on, and so when I was reading your description of barefoot running, it made me wince, you know. I think it makes most people wince if they're used to being shod, but at the same time, when I read that comment about gardening, it made me think of having the grounding you get with your other limbs, your hands, like when you're actually touching soil, and I feel the same about touching rock, real rock.
Precisely. Yeah.
And I always remember going back to Orkney with Ed Drummond, and you know, he had poor health. He was in the late stage of his life, and we were on that big standing stone in the walk into the Old Man Ahoy, and he was like almost hugging it, but he was touching the holds of the sarette, and you could see that it was just such a release for him, you know. It was just really replenishing, and he was saying, oh, this is like an old friend. And I thought, yeah, that's, to me, like that feeling of touching rock, it is like magical. It's actually magic, where if I've not done it for a while, like I just had a surgery and I was out from real rock, and when I actually was before I could go back to rock climbing, I had to go somewhere, and I was just by this river, and I just went down to the rocks in the river, and I was just touching the rocks, and it was just like, oh, that just feels so good. Yeah. And it's so silly to say out loud in a way, although I don't feel silly saying it to you because it makes perfect sense to you.
Yeah, absolutely. We've created this thing where nature's one thing and we're another, and we need to kind of
Yeah.
We can use it as therapy, but actually just being in, you don't have to do anything, because just by touching rock, by being in forests, by being anywhere natural, we're connecting to a part of ourselves.
I was thinking about this over the last day, and I'm really interested in this idea of the use of the word therapy for it, because it makes it more akin to being like medicine, like a drug. Like if you're ill, you get this therapy to make you better, and then you don't need it anymore. But I always think, oh, maybe that's not quite right. Like exposure to nature and actually touching the earth, like the literal grounding as well as metaphorical, it's more akin to something like sleep. It's like you wouldn't say to someone, only use sleep as a therapy if you're ill. It's just an essential part of life. So sleep and nutrition,
yeah, precisely. I mean, one way of looking at it would be that actually our disconnection from nature is causing all these problems with our mental health.
I think people are more and more realising that they are good and they're doing them, but it still seems like a kind of hard sell to a big proportion of folk. I mean, I must admit, even for myself, so like one of the things I'm aware of is that I think the stress that in my life is primarily training stress. It's like a total load of work and training stress. It's not a traumatic thing. None of my work or climbing or anything is traumatic, but it does have its own stress in terms of physical and mental workload that needs to be balanced with rest, and it's the same for many climbers. Lots of people watching this channel, and I'm constantly trying to say to anyone who will listen, like, if you want to be a good climber, one of the best things you can do is move to the mountains. Not just because it removes a lot of the stresses of having to travel away from cities and get to the mountains, but also because it allows you to, on your rest days from your training or whatever, to just come and do things like we're doing right now, just sit in the woods and either talk to a friend or just be on your own. Why does it seem such a hard sell? Because I think of things like yoga, like an activity like yoga, or even doing what you're doing, just going swimming or going for a walk in the woods. Much as I know that it would maybe be beneficial to me, I still actually have to discipline myself to do it. Why do you think that is?
Things like yoga and meditation and these things are all beneficial to our physical and mental health. It's still hard to do them, and to kind of almost sometimes I feel like you're feeling like, oh, I know I should go into the water, but I haven't, and I can't be bothered. And then just to make yourself do it, I've never felt worse getting out of the water. I've never regretted it. But even though now I've been doing it for 8-9 years since 2015, still I find a resistance to it. So it's it's an ongoing process for sure.
I've been writing a book myself about my own climbing, and I was talking about how I started to respond really well to training in the year before I did Rhapsody, the first E11. And the purpose of my book was to try and explain, in my own opinion, why I was able to go from being quite average at climbing and overtake a lot of my peers. And because it was like, how did I end up doing this really hard route? It seemed kind of silly. But one of the things that I thought about was, in that this summer, I was going to Dumbarton, and I was doing fingerboarding at home, but then I'd go to Dumbarton and just do really easy circuits, like extremely, like not getting pumped, just going round and round for long periods. But it was actually the rest in between, where I'd have like 20 minutes on the wall and then 20 minutes sitting down, and I was just sitting watching the Clyde go by. And the more time that's gone by, the more I think it's that time that was important. And to explain it in physiological terms, I would say it's the difference between your sympathetic nervous system activation, fight or flight, the intensity of training, versus the parasympathetic activation. That's the rest and digest part of your nervous system. That's the part that's giving you your recovery, and I think that's what's underrated in both sport, performance and health. It's that parasympathetic activation, and that's what all these activities you described give you.
And with PTSD, obviously your fight or flight is just on.
Yeah.
And that's certainly what I've experienced. at various times, is that it's about learning how to cope with the stresses and strains of everyday life. I still work in television. I'm still doing all these things and that require a great deal from me, but it's recognizing it within yourself, I think. That we are susceptible to stress, and if we don't watch ourselves, we can kind of get caught in that fight or flight zone. To try and take us out of that is when the nature comes in for me. And I guess for anyone, it's their own way of finding what works for them. But all I can say is for me, certainly being in nature has always been my go-to place, and certainly after all these experiences, it's become more and more important to me.
Yeah, and I always keep coming back to that for climbers or any sports people or anyone at all. Thinking to look after their health is both exercise, connection with nature, and connection with people. They're all independently important, I think. Yeah, and if you ignore any one, then at minimum would reduce your resilience to the stresses of life that are inevitably going to come your way.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that's it, isn't it? It's not. There's not one thing here. This is there's so many strands to it, but healing is an ongoing process.
So there's a link in the description below to Joe's book Out of Mind, which he's just published, which goes through the detail of those Everest disasters as well as his running and his life in general. So thanks for listening to this episode, and we'll see you in the next one.